Hello, everybody, and welcome to the NextGen Planners podcast. My name is Amelia Hamilton, and I am the head of community here at NextGen Planners. And in today's show, I am joined by the brilliant Marc Hendriks. Welcome, Marc. It's great to have you.
Hi, Amelia. Delighted to be with you.
Brilliant. So to kick things off, we always like to ask our guests, what does a day in your life look like? What's a day in the life of Marc Hendriks like?
Well, a really interesting question, Amelia, to start things off with. Well, being a small startup, my day can really vary. The good thing is I no longer commute to London, so my carbon footprint has diminished significantly. But I don't seem to have really gained any extra time in my day. It's extraordinary. So obviously the day is really around what the demands of the business need on that particular day. So it's not as structured as I have been used to for most of my career. I suppose I'm really around three things. There's product development, which is a major part of what I do. And that just involves a lot of reading. I mean, I spend a lot of time reading, and I think that is the big difference. That's probably where my time goes, is reading, because especially in this ESG landscape, there is so much to digest and impossible to remember. So product development, working with Excel spreadsheets, building up logic for our capable CTO, Luke Harbour, to then hard code that into our platform. So that's where I spend a lot of time. Marketing, obviously, we're spending a lot of time on that, talking to prospects and trying to garner their interest and getting feedback from existing clients as to how we can do that. So a lot of time on the phone, Zoom calls. I hardly meet anybody in person these days. It's really all Zoom calls. So that's kind of a big change. It's nice to get out every now and then, but Zoom calls are very efficient for the kind of business side of things. And then there's ad hoc stuff like, PI insurance, arranging that, all sorts of sort of everyday business things that, when you work for a large organization, goes pretty much unseen. So that's how I spend my time. And it's basically sitting here on this chair in my office, which you can see is kind of messy, but full of literature. And and that's how I spend my day. And then the nice things, I get out, prune some roses every now and then, get some fresh air. Pick up the weeds. Not so much now. Now weeds are allowed in gardens. I'm much relieved. I've got a lot of weeds, I can promise you.
I've been trying to.
So
I live in London. Yeah, it sounds lovely. I live in London, so I obviously don't have a garden. But I was very on at my parents, the whole no mow May. Let's leave some weeds. Let's leave some wildflowers. Got to save the bees. So I think they are not as on board with that idea. They like a nice, very neat garden. So I have to try and get them.
I'm fully on board. I'm fully on board. Needs must.
Yes, exactly.
That's my day. So yeah, very different from when I was, in an office working for a large organization. So it's nice. It's a good change.
Yeah, it sounds it. And you touched on some really interesting points there. And one of those being, you have to stay on top of reading and literature so much because of the kind of the nature of how complex this landscape is, this ESG landscape. So looking at how, dense and complicated it can be, how do you think that these challenges might impact investors and that kind of decision-making process?
Yeah, I think this is, this ESG, the whole climate change, sustainable investment, it's really complicated. So I've spent my entire career doing mainly, normal fundamental analysis, economics. So I'm an economist by background before I moved to the buy side as CIO in a couple of organizations. So always felt that blending economics and investments was really very, very important to me and to clients to understand what's going on. But in the last really 12 years, certainly my last position started to get involved really with impact investing and in sustainability, because of being involved with a lot of younger people who, it's not just younger people, but primarily them at that stage, who wanted to be good investors. So I think trying to understand this landscape is more complicated now, because you need to have so many skills that I think we just really not all of us have, or very few people really have. One is a good scientific basis for this, to understand what's going on with the climate. And I think that is important when it comes to investment, because how do you know what we're going to come onto this in a lot more detail, no, but how do you know what you're investing in is really making a good impact when there is such a big discussion about sustainable investments and so on? So my starting point, I think, is how do we get here in the first instance? I think is really it's really important to understand. And we know that it's result of human activity and the emission of CO2. And there may be some people who still deny that and say it's just the weather. But I think most people, when you read the paper every day, today included, about what's going on in the southern states of the United States of America, it's just, it's hard you can't deny what's going on, and it's really depressing. But you need to really understand that. And then to understand the economics behind that is, how was it that we allowed CO2 emissions to basically be emitted? Well, one is, let's say we didn't know. Of course, that's not entirely the case, as we now are finding out, but we didn't know. But secondly, our economic system didn't price the carbon emissions. It didn't price pollution. So it's a freebie. So if I can produce something and I'm just polluting and I'm not being charged for it, but I'm making profits on that, then nothing's going to stop me from doing that. So I think we need to understand that. So when we then come to trying to think about the investment side, it's really a combination of all of those things. It's trying to assess the science behind climate change, and it's a race that some may think is already lost, actually, but it's a race between the science to change, to solve the climate crisis, and also a race. If we can't do it that way, what economic changes do we need to make? And as an economist, what I find really interesting is the whole new literature, economic literature, that's grown up with things that were simply unheard of when I was studying economics. Particularly things like the degrowth school. What we don't need economic growth, we actually need degrowth. And these are very complicated things. And you try to translate that into investment. And investments are all about growth and profitability. So if you think we're going to go into a degrowth environment, how are we going to implement an investment strategy that can actually be successful in that instance? So it's so complicated, and that of course makes it compelling, actually. But from an investor who's busy, who's got their own busy life, the retail investor, which is where we're really thinking about, a retail investor who's working every day, can't keep up with all this, and how do they, what do they do? And they want to be good investors. What do they do? How do they do that? So yeah, it's a real challenge for the industry.
Absolutely. And I think you highlighted a really interesting point there in the fact that it is a race, and it's a race that, a lot of people have argued we've lost already. And taking that into account, would you say that there is a certain demographic? I know you mentioned that young people were, perhaps more concerned about it. Is there a misconception that it's only young people or younger people who understand that there is that kind of time pressure and necessity to act now? Or has the dial kind of shifted towards the types of people who seem to be as engaged in the conversation?
Yeah, I think there is a misconception. So young people, it is across all age groups. So I do visit our local net zero place here in Guildford, where we do a lot of activities, showing films and educational programs on a wide range of things. And it's across all age groups that are now attending. And surveys show that, older people are also just as engaged in the debate. In fact, are more likely to recycle than younger people, interesting enough. So I think it is across all ages. The difference is, because this is about investments, the difference is, of course, that older people, because their investment profile naturally will be different to that of a younger person, so they're more concerned about keeping what they've got and adding to that. We're in a cost of living crisis. Older people worried about how they're going to look after themselves when they're no longer working and so on. So there is a different investment profile, whereas younger people are more prepared to go for sustainable investments on the basis that it's one that's fits their time profile from an investments perspective, but also because they're going to be around longer and they're going to see the consequences of climate change even more than people like hate to think of myself as older, but you've got to accept that have fewer years left on this planet than someone like yourself, Amelia. So so obviously you're going to be much more aware. But I think it is across the board, which is good. But how people want to tackle that is different. So whether you're going to be protesting and an activist does, I think, depend to some extent on age. Although we see many older activists, of course, prepared to risk things, risk jail and all the rest of it to be an activist. But from an investment perspective, there will be definitely difference in the way in which they approach the markets.
Yeah, I mean, you don't look a day over 21, Mark, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much.
But it's really interesting, and I guess then where to go from there is if you do take somebody who has decided, this is important to me. I think, I know that this is where I need to be putting my money. This is where, there can be tangible result with where I'm investing. How do you then help demystify this landscape, and how can you kind of guide people towards making better informed choices and decisions?
Yeah. So, I mean, that is in the laps of the advisors, obviously, to do that. And I think so. For retail investors, there's really a choice of two ways. One is they're going to do it themselves and do the investigation. So I'll come back onto that in a moment. And the second one is you're going to rely on an advisor to help you. And I think most people will probably prefer to go down that route. But you've got to ask yourselves questions. There is this incredible statistic that survey data shows that over 80% of retail investors want to integrate some kind of ESG into their investments. But according to a major platform survey, only 6% of actually retail investors actually manage to do that. And you compare that with an industry survey that shows that only 20% of advisors are actually able to provide ESG advice. So there is this enormous gap in the market. And so if you're a retail investor and you're going to your advisor and you say, I want to do ESG, you've really got to ask a lot of detailed questions to see what the response is. We've spoken to a lot of IFAs, and it's a very mixed bag. There are some absolutely committed, very well-informed IFAs offering only sustainable investments, and they really go into detail. And there are other IFAs that really shun away from ESG for understandable reasons, because it's a tricky regulatory environment, and providing advice in an area that you may not feel comfortable in doing so can have catastrophic consequences for you. So if you are a retail investor, you really need to go to those advisors, and you want to do ESG, and you may not understand what it is, and we'll come on to that. You may not understand what it is, but you just want to invest sustainably. You need to go to advisors that really do care and have dug deep into it. Now, from an advisor perspective, this is really difficult. I mean, we keep using the word complex because it is. The whole thing about assessing whether an investment or a company, so whether a company is good or bad for the climate, is complicated. And the larger the company, the more complicated it is. And the complication is because one is, supply chains are very long and detailed, and getting the data is very difficult. So this is all about the data. And as we know, companies now are obliged, especially in the EU, to publish sustainability reports, and they have to give data on a whole host of ESG things, gender diversity, biodiversity impact, CO2 emissions, and so on. And there's a lot of data, quite detailed data. there are two problems with it. One is, what does the data, well, there's several problems. One is, what does this data mean? Do people really know? What does it mean to be adversely affecting biodiversity? What is that statistic collecting? Can we trust the statistic because it's all self-reported from companies? And is there greenwashing involved? Are they just disguising the data? And it's very difficult to verify their company data. And the third thing is actually accessing this data. Accessing this data is very expensive to get full access. There are some free sites available. MSCI, just for example, runs a free site where you can look at some basic ESG data, CO2 data on funds, but it's very lean. And to purchase this data from them or other providers is very expensive. And to be quite honest, most IFAs can't afford it. I mean, they're running on pretty narrow margins, and the data providers are really targeting the asset managers. And as a retail investor, you have no chance of getting access to this data. So you need to really have a long discussion with your advisor. And if the advisor says, I want to have ESG, and the advisor at least appears to be open to that and says, yes, we have some ideas here, let's discuss that, that's a good sign. If the advisor says, you ask a question and they say, I don't know, but I'll come back to you, that's an excellent sign, because advisors are not going to know all of the details. It's just impossible to know. So I think that's a good sign that that's a good group to be looking for. Even better is if the advisor says, well, let's discuss what you mean by ESG, and we may come to this a little bit later on, because ESG means different things to different people. So I think if you want to be sustainably aligned with your investments and with your own values, having an advisor looking at all of those issues, I think, is a good sign that that's a good one. I mean, they can be quite hard to find. I mean, let's be honest about that. And it takes time, but I think people who care will take the time to do that.
Absolutely. And I think that maybe that's a great place to move into now in the discussion, is what is ESG? Like you said, it's vague, it's used to kind of encompass a lot of things, and sometimes it's kind of viewed as just the environment side of ESG, but it's still called that. And obviously we have impact investing, and there's so much nuance to it. I guess it's a huge question, but do you have some kind of thoughts or something you could sum up as what is ESG?
Yeah, we do have some thoughts on that as within our company. So, I mean, ESG was first raised in 2004 with the United Nations report. So, and it seemed like a good idea, I suppose. It was a report that was backed by all the large asset managers, so looked like a conflict of interest, but nevertheless, intentions are obviously good. Whether it's the best framework for thinking about these things, I'm not sure, but it's the one that we've got. So it's environment, social, and governance. That's what it stands for. I think everybody will know that who's listening to this broadcast, so I haven't really added much there, but it's a CPD point, I think. But anyway, it's ESG. But within that, there are many factors. So just for example, in the data set that we use, there are 38 sort of factors that cover ESG. And I think you're absolutely right, Amelia, that initially people thought it was all about the environment, but we've kind of moved to the social factors, the gender diversity and all those things, and then governance on whistleblowing and all those various factors. So it has become a really quite a difficult thing. And and the reason for that is because say, well, you can't really have sustainability if you don't have good governance and you don't have social equality. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. But for an individual, they may have something different. So for me personally, the most important thing to fight the climate crisis, to be quite frank, is CO2 emissions. That would be my target. So the E would be the most important thing. Other people have something different, and there's no right or wrong. That's a completely personal view, value aligned, and so on. So how do we find that? How do we know? If I go to an advisor, how to say, okay, Mark, how do I know what your preferences are. Now, there's been quite a lot of work done in the industry on this. It's mainly around questionnaires, and this is still evolving. All right, so there's questionnaire groups that offer questionnaires that say we can find out what your ESG is through a series of questionnaires. We've actually come up with something different, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but we just say, look, you know what? There's 15 factors here, and just rank them. Just put them equally or one under the other. So, what's most important for you? CO2 emission, renewable energy, whistleblowing policy, bribery and corruption. Just rank them where in the order as you think, and ranking. So it's just direct. It's not a questionnaire. It's just direct, and people may not know. In this case, they don't know. But if you have a view, you can then come up with some kind of footprint as to what a person's ESG preferences are. That's quantifiable, measurable, consistent, because there's no kind of subjectivity in the questionnaire behind it. And then, so however you do that, that's the first important thing to do. The next thing, though, is there's no point asking someone what their ESG preferences are, and then not matching that to a portfolio or fund suggestion. And that's the really difficult bit. So if you come up with an ESG footprint, then you have to offer funds that are consistent with that ESG footprint. Now, for an advisor that is building a portfolio from the bottom up, that means from building up funds, not companies, but funds. I think they have a better chance of doing that because they say, okay, so we can get some climate change, carbon reduction fund specialists here, or we can have greater women diversity, have fund here and so on. So you can pick those funds up. The problem is that a lot of IFAs use model portfolio solutions, which are kind of off-the-shelf bundled portfolios, and then you have to understand what's inside those portfolios, and that becomes very complex. And you're then really relying on the asset manager to tell you what's in those funds. And I don't think that's such a good approach, but it is, I think it's a majority approach. Whether it will stay like that, we'll wait and see. But I think, matching the portfolio to your ESG preference is absolutely essential. Otherwise, there was no point in trying to discover what the ESG footprint of an individual was or is. So I think that's something I would definitely look out for. And I just want to say it's very tricky because within a fund, you may have 100 companies, 150 companies, and then, I came across, so there are like definitional issues, right? So I was talking to one manager, and they had a renewable energy company, quite well known renewable energy company. Then doing the deep dive into the supply chain, discovered that there was a fossil fuel generator on standby in case things should collapse. And because they are a zero fossil fuel, the debate they're having is, should this fund, which is very well known, big fund, should it be in the portfolio or not? And that becomes a kind of a subjectivity. They decided that it should be because actually they never used it, and it's a part of the transition. And another interesting one, there's another fund, again, sustainable fund, that discovered that it actually had a holding in a sustainable global packaging company, very big. And so you think on the face of it, that's a very good thing. Then discovered that 6% of its revenue came because it sold its product to tobacco companies. So, it just shows how complicated and difficult that is. And to be honest, if you're the retail investor, you would never know that there was a tobacco exposure in that fund. So, it's just highlighting some of the practicalities between trying to find out what's really going on in your fund. I think at the end of the day, Amelia, so long as you're doing your best as an investor and trying, it's better than not doing anything at all if you care about the climate crisis. So it's not going to be perfect, and this is going to get a lot better and a lot more transparent. But at the moment, there are lots of difficulties, and we shouldn't be surprised if trying to be good investors, we get tripped up every now and then by discovering something. But I don't think we should beat ourselves up, and it shouldn't stop us from trying.
Absolutely.
Or the advisory community from also trying to do their best.
Yes, exactly. And hopefully that's where, people are moving towards. You go, it's not perfect, but doing nothing is not really seen as an option, hopefully, at some point, that, it's becoming so prevalent that even if it's not perfect, even if you're not, you know, the most focused, best ESG sustainable, you know, company, you're doing something, and you have options, and you're moving the dial, you're moving in the right direction. And you mentioned you know, planners or advisors who use MPS. Do you have any kind of advice perhaps to them who are, you know, looking through what they've got in their portfolios to try and see if there are any immediate red flags, without, you know, obviously having to trawl through everything with all the details and all the small print? Are there any kind of tips or tricks, just more generally, that is like, well, that's a definite no, or alternatively, green flag, you know, that's a definite yes, that's definitely something that you should be looking out for?
I think it's so tricky, Amelia, this one. I'd rather approach it to say, I think you just want full transparency. So the data does exist there, but asset managers are providing filters. So there are minimum thresholds. So, you know, you take the tobacco company as an example, you know, if it, you know, they'll say, okay, if it's less than 5% or 10% or whatever the number is, then we're going to accept it. Whereas I think, you know, a more transparent way to say is actually there is some exposure to fossil fuel energy, but and the number is one, rather than having the cutoff and saying it's 1% or 2%. So I think just being completely transparent, because to some extent that shows the investor how complicated this is, and I think that. And I think that's a useful exercise to show that it is that you know, this is not a straightforward exercise to invest sustainably, that there are choices to be made, and how strict you want to be. And you should leave that, enable the retail, the ultimate investor should have the right to be able to do that. You should also just see, you know, how much, you know, we use this word stewardship. And I think, you know, how much are the asset managers engaging, or even the IFA engaging with the companies directly, and how effective is that? So again, you know, I'm slightly cynical on this to some extent. You know, all asset managers, we engage actively with the company, we talk to them. I know that's a really, really hard thing to do. Does the company really listen, and so on? And so there's a little bit of, I'm not saying that's greenwashing, but a bit of storytelling around to make you sound good. And I think one just needs to be slightly cautious on that. Voting records important, but you know, I look at voting records and you can see that some asset managers vote the right way, so they vote yes, but when it comes to CEO compensation, they're going to go no, no, no. But how effective is that? You know, what real difference is that making? So there are these aspects to the detail that I think one needs to look at. So I think being open and honest about the discussion, rather than trying to, even with the best on saying we are truly sustainable, you know, you could say, actually, you know, we're just doing our best here, and we're being honest, and we are, you know, we're moving in that direction, but there is a transition. The companies have to be practical about these things to some extent, and then as a retail investor, I can either say I absolutely want no fossil fuel, because I think that is the most important thing, is that we just have to stop it. You know, I'm an XR, you know, person, and I just want to stop that. Then I know that I can make the right choice, rather than it being filtered out and saying, okay, actually there's something left in there. So I think it's a tricky one. We're also going to have a whole raft of new, well, yes, probably, of regulations coming from the FCA on ESG, from data providers, you know, to the naming of funds, you know, labeling of funds. And that's going to be a really interesting development when those reports eventually sort of come out. It's taken much longer than people thought, but is expected sometime this year, maybe next year. So that's going to be quite important landscape, and hopefully a further improvement for retail investors in understanding what's actually going on. A challenge for the advisory community, of course, but one that is coming.
Brilliant. And I mean, we have talked a lot about how difficult it is, and it is. It's, you know, it's a topic that's important. It's something that is really necessary, but obviously comes with its own faults or intricacies and things to navigate. However, I'd quite like to talk about kind of the performance side of things as well, and highlight perhaps some positives there. And not only is it important just to do, but it can be quite good too. Looking at this kind of growing body of evidence is demonstrating potential for superior risk-adjusted returns through sustainable investing. Could you provide any examples or insights into that kind of symbiotic relationship between ESG considerations and financial performance?
Well, I've certainly got some views on this, Amelia. So this is right in my
Great.
wheelhouse in a sense.
Excellent.
Firstly, I just want to say that I think that's not how we should approach the question, to be perfectly frank.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should be investing sustainably regardless of the returns. If we're trying to spin a story that ESG is going to offer, investing is going to offer better returns, it may not. All right, and I'll come on to that in a moment. It may not, but I don't think that's a story you want to tell. We want to say you should invest sustainably, because if we don't invest sustainably as kind of one of the levers to help us get out of this climate crisis, then there's going to be absolutely no point in investing at all. All right, because we're going to have a climate crisis and we have no idea what the landscape is going to look like if we are hitting 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees. I mean, it's just going to be it's just not worth thinking about. So I think for me that would be the first starting point. On the returns side, I know you're suggesting there, Amelia, there is a large body or a growing body of evidence to suggest outperformance from ESG adjusted. So first thing I would say is, as an economist looking at this, we don't have enough data to prove that. So again, I'm just being straightforward on that. And it all depends on the time period. When you look at it, as we know, there was a period 2 years ago when ESG investments, pre-Ukraine, when ESG investments were doing extremely well. That was because there was a kind of it was a very slow burn, this whole ESG investment, right? That people didn't really buy into it, asset managers didn't buy into it, pension funds didn't buy into it, and then all of a sudden people bought into it. So there was like a one-off swell of injection into ESG related funds, the creation of ESG products by large asset managers to capture this market. And obviously it did very well. And then we have seen that the performance hasn't been so good. So my view on this, theoretically, investing in sustainable investments, i.e., let's say that are not going to be in companies that are left with stranded assets like fossil fuel, assuming that we do pursue a path of avoiding the climate crisis and closing down fossil fuel supplies and moving to renewables quickly, speedily, then a portfolio that avoids those assets is obviously going to be should provide better returns. If you look at the companies, they obviously don't agree with that because they're increasing production and so on. And we see today just emissions from fossil fuel still going up. So there's an issue there. But theoretically, they should. But my slight concern about the industry in here is that we're now beginning to see lots. Factor investing is very popular. Like you pick up, like inflation, a GDP, a particular factor that you think over time provides a better source of return against the benchmark, and those factors are kind of are when they're in play, they're very good, and when they're not in play, they're obviously really bad. So you switch. And then I saw yesterday, a gender equality fund that was being produced, showing that claiming that if you have women leading companies, they provide better returns. And I just think, look, we shouldn't be investing for that. We should be doing that because that's the right thing to do because we're creating equality, but we shouldn't be expecting better returns. And anyway, as an economist, you're trying to work out what has caused the returns to a share price, and saying that it's down to a single factor is is impossible. There are too many variables that determine a share price. So you're going to get false correlations. So I'm really wary of, again, linking what we should be doing with returns. I think the bottom line for me on all of this is that if you run, so this is what we know. We know that active managers generally do not beat the benchmark. All right. So stock picking tends not to work. I know that's going to be scream of emails back on that probably, but there's loads of evidence about that. That is defensible. We know that factor investing can work at different periods. So if you're a smart factor investor, that's great. But if you have a diversified portfolio, you're going to be pretty much in line with the benchmark return, which is about as good as you can get. The best thing about it, though, is that you will be investing sustainably, whereas the benchmark is not. So what I think is what we want is the same as a benchmark return, but with sustainable investment goals. And I think that's what we should be aiming for. And I think the rest, frankly, is we'll find out in another 10 years, really, whether it worked or not, but we just don't have enough information. There is a very kind of controversial paper that's been written. I don't have it to hand, but actually turns the whole ESG thing on its head and says they looked at a portfolio and they looked at voting behavior and they saw that funds that became sustainable investment funds didn't necessarily have a better voting behavior than other funds. If people are interested, I can get a reference to it. It's just interesting to see that. So shorter answer is just keep it diversified, keep it sustainable if that's what that aligns with your values. And the performance is, frankly, what the performance will be. And by far the biggest factor that's going to invest returns is what's going to happen to interest rates. That's always the most important factor. And we have a very difficult investing environment ahead of us with inflation, rising interest rates, and a pretty weak economic growth, plus all of this transitional sustainable investment, the transition to a net zero going on. So it's a very complicated investment environment without worrying about small factors, frankly, about generating a slightly better return. So I just think the emphasis is the wrong way around. But it is what it is, because also worth saying, if you're promoting a fund to generate excess returns, and this has been a problem with traditional investing, it puts pressure on fund managers, right? Because they've got to outperform the index or they're going to lose their jobs. And then that gives rise to, well, maybe I need to bring in something a bit more trendy. Maybe it's got a bit more fossil fuel in there. It could be promoting greenwashing. So I think it's a difficult thing. I know return is important, but I think it needs to be return. Sustainably adjusted returns would be very, very nice to have. We don't have that number yet. A Sharpe ratio with an ESG factor in it is the holy grail, and that would be a good conversation to have with someone.
Yeah, what a great answer. I really like that. I think it's really nice to hear. Sometimes returns aren't the most important thing, and aligning your money with something that's more meaningful and something that actually is going to make a difference, and we have some kind of obligation to do, is perhaps more the narrative that we should be talking about. Have you ever encountered, and if so, are there kind of arguments you would put to people who have said, but I need, my clients are not interested in, this ESG thing. They just think that put the money wherever it makes, a good enough return, and investing sustainably isn't going to make that much difference. So I'd rather just quote unquote play it safe and put it in something that's diversified enough, but without a particular focus. Are there any kind of narratives that you have that you could help bring some around into your way of thinking and change the way that they might want to invest?
Well, I think Amelia, you said it yourself there, actually. So if they say to you, investing sustainably is not going to make that much difference to my return, then I would say, then why not do it? Because it might make a difference, and it will certainly make a difference to the climate. So why wouldn't you do it? In a sense, is what I would say. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
I think it's as simple as that, and a short message is better received than a long a long
For
message,
sure. Yeah.
given people's attention spans are so short, it seems, these days. So
Yeah.
so
And I also
so
think sometimes if you do, it's sometimes death by statistics, isn't it? If you go, well, if you look at this and this is happening, is that it's happening, and you just go, well, why not? Let's just you can guide people into a better direction. Then yeah, you're right. I think yeah, a good headline is always better than what's it? Too long didn't read. Just have a snappy headline, and hopefully they'll pay attention to that.
yeah, especially, already investing is a very statistical, data heavy subject. And now we've added climate change and ESG, and we've just multiplied the data and the complexity by, I don't know, pick a number, it's at least tenfold, right? So it becomes even more difficult to talk about. So in a sense, storytelling about why you should do sustainability is very important. In fact, storytelling about, I'm an investor and I have invested in a sustainable fund. Tell me the story. How have I actually helped? And that is something, again, that's a real challenge for the industry, something we're trying to work on, which is, what is the narrative? Because just saying, oh, your CO2 imprint was this and that, and yes, sometimes they're just not enough. So there needs to be a better story for those that really want to know. Of course, there are those who just say, I've invested sustainably and I'm just going to trust it, and that's fine. One of the interesting things that we did do earlier on is, you can, as an individual, work out your own carbon footprint, for example. So there are plenty of free websites in which you can do that. And you can see where your footprint is. So if you're, is it coming from your traveling? Is it coming from your diet, and so on? And you can actually then kind of set up an inverse portfolio. So if you are doing a lot of traveling, investing in a large part of your portfolio in a green transport policy, for example, is quite a nice way of offsetting your lifestyle. That's not to mean you keep your lifestyle the same, but it's like kind of offsetting your lifestyle, because presumably your lifestyle is, if you're concerned about climate, is being adjusted. I know that's difficult, but it's adjusting anyway. So you can have an offset portfolio for your lifestyle, and also it tells a story a little bit better because you can match that meaningfully to what you personally are doing. Just an idea. I mean, I'm not saying it's the right thing to do, but it's just something that we found people quite liked.
Yeah, and I guess it's that idea of kind of personalization. If you can really get buy-in in that, and something that feels a bit more real that you're doing with your money, instead of, it's just kind of out there doing something. You're like, well, I do this, and then I'm doing this to help, and hopefully that would increase kind of buy-in from that respect.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of buy-in anyway. I mean, if someone really doesn't care and doesn't believe in it, they're not going to, whatever you say, frankly, he's not going to do it. He's not going to change them. And also, if you're an older person, right, and you've had a way of doing things and you're with an IFA, that's doing things the same way, then it's going to be very difficult to change those strategies. But I think for people who are willing, they want to know the story and what's behind it. And that is, again, I keep saying the word difficult. It's just so much more difficult than just saying your return was 2% above the MSCI all cap world index this year. That's a great story, right? That's so easy to tell. But actually you contributed 20 million tons of CO2 through your investment strategy when you could have actually only done 5. I don't know, that's the kind of story you need to tell. Or you generated 50% more renewable energy. And that's the kind of story that you need to tell in a coherent, short, pithy way, because then you need to add in the S factors and the G factors, and that's when the story becomes quite long. So that's when it's useful to know what a person is actually looking for and what their values are. And so you can align the returns, not just the quantitative returns, but the value aligned returns back to the individual. And I think that's the really interesting aspect for the advisor community, actually.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I could talk to you about that all day, Mark, but time is ticking on, and I still got a couple of questions that we like to ask everybody on our podcast. So I'm going to move on to those now before I get distracted. So the first question then is: we always like to ask our guests for a book that has helped them in their career so far. So do you have a book that comes to mind?
Yeah, so obviously you did ask me this in advance, so this is not a spur of the moment thing, and it was a really interesting question because I suppose I'm influenced more by people than by books. I read books, and then the best book is always the last one that I read, and that's the one that most influenced me. But there is one book that I always go to, and so I don't know if you can see it there.
No.
It's The Age of the Economist by Daniel Fussfeld. And it's quite interesting. So this goes through. So I just, I am an economist, and I think a good understanding of economics, economic philosophy, theory is really, really, it's kind of should be fundamental for everybody. And this is an excellent readable book about economic thought through the ages. It's quite interesting. So I think I bought this book in 1978. So this is, I think it was the third edition. It's now in its 9th edition, and I just looked it up on Amazon, and I paid, probably can't see it, £3.95, and today it's £52. Absolutely staggered. But for me, that has been a super useful book, one that I've always gone to when I'm having to write something or look something up. And so, yeah, probably something you weren't quite expecting, but that would be my book of choice.
Absolutely. And what would £3.95 would have been a lot of money back in those olden days, though, wouldn't it? It would have been.
Well, I could afford it as a student, so not sure a student can afford £52.
Gosh, no, that's not. Oh, no, it's a lot of money, isn't it? Blimey. Okay, right. Final question for you. It's not a small one; it's a big one. What are you most excited to see in the world of finance in the next 10 years?
Yes, this is a hell of a question, isn't it? And actually, it's big, but I actually, so everybody talks about open banking and crypto and all the rest. For me, actually, the one thing, free ESG data. So as an economist, I have been able to get free economic data throughout my entire career. I know people sell it, but you can also go to national authorities, download the very straightforward, very easy. I can get any economic data I want, and I don't need to pay for it. And it really irks me that the ESG data, which is provided free for companies, costs so much money because it's not being provided in an easy format for people to be able to get hold of. I actually think this should be a government's, like, you should come under the ONS, the national statistic agencies of each country, is that they should be the ones who are actually collating this data. They could then verify it rather being given as a private sector initiative. But anyway, it is what it is. But at some stage, this data will become free. And then the great thing is then some system, something that I can't even imagine what it would be to enable retail investors to access this data, integrate it, and look at it themselves for their investments. I think would be tremendous. That will require all kind of AI and all the rest of it. But I think that for me would be a really worthwhile development for financial markets and understanding what's going on. I'll leave others to talk about crypto and Bitcoin and open banking and all that stuff. I'm much more of an investment person, so I think just making that field more transparent and accessible to retail, so institutional level of research information to retail investors, is what they should be able to get in an easily digestible format. That would, I think, would be tremendous, so that the end investor can take more control and have investment portfolios that are more aligned with what they want to do than what somebody else wants them to do, essentially. So that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah. And I mean, hopefully that takes less than 10 years. That would be great, wouldn't it?
Well, we'll see. It's a hell of a challenge, big data,
Yeah.
but maybe, I don't know. So
You think it'll take more than 10 years? What's your
I
timeline?
have no
What do
idea.
you reckon?
I don't, I'm not, I'll forecast inflation. I don't want to forecast technology. It's probably 3 or 4. I would go 3 or 4 years. I don't know, 5 years. There's a lot of vested interest in keeping this data private, obviously. So I think that's there's a lot of money gone into creating these private data services. So that I do think they're going to become stranded assets, to be really controversial. And it will become freely available. But so I don't know. So I think it's probably less about the technology than about the vested interests, I suspect, because they will want their return on capital before they give it up. So yeah, but yeah, I don't know. And further afield, I don't, things are changing so fast, I can't even think. I mean, I just think it's all hovering around, everything is around the mobile phone. It's just extraordinary what you're able to do. So I'm quite sure that the developments will be primarily around enabling retail investors and transparency. So that's where open banking does come in. That's been quite slow, actually, but I'm sure that will speed up. And so you have a fully integrated banking, investment, savings, loans, through a single provider, probably one single app that has providers behind it, that makes our lives as retail investors and consumers easier. So I think that's what I'll be looking for. I mean, if you wanted something slightly more quirky, it would be the field when we haven't talked about it. I'm not intending to get into that right now, but impact investing is obviously very, very, we talk about ESG, but impact investing is maybe where the biggest climate change can be. And that's just purely for the private equity investor, high net worth individuals. And is there a way, and I know there are efforts to try and make that available to retail investors and make it liquid. And I think that's an area of financial development for financial markets that could be really quite interesting. But I'm sure you're going to have somebody come and talk about that. That's because that's a really interesting field, but it's not for now. That probably is a 10-year thing, I suspect.
Yeah. Indeed. Well, on that note, I will say thank you very much, Marc Hendriks, for joining me. This has been an excellent conversation.
Thank you very much, Amelia, and thank you for asking me.
Thank you. So that was Marc Hendriks on the NextGen Planners podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it on all social media platforms. You can listen to past and future episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and on our website, which is nextgenplanners.co.uk. There you can also find lots more information about our brilliant community. And finally, if you can, do leave us a review. It helps to grow the podcast so we can get it out to even more people. Thank you.